In this lesson, we're going to talk about the different types of selection. First, we'll recap what natural selection is. Remember, another term for it is survival of the fittest. So selective forces affect populations, and as a result, some individuals are more likely to survive and reproduce than others. This causes changes in allele frequencies of a population, which can then lead to evolutionary change. So if one allele is favored, then you're going to have more of that allele in the population than, say, a different type. So one example of a type of selection is sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is not a great condition to have. What happens is if you have the condition, which is autosomal recessive, under times of stress, physical stress, your red blood cells collapse and form the sickle shape, and they're not able to carry oxygen. So you'll exhaust really quickly, and you'll have characteristics of anemia. It's not a good condition to have. It is autosomal recessive, but the interesting thing about this condition is you find it in populations that are close to areas that have a lot of malaria. And what has happened is if you're heterozygous for sickle cell anemia, you don't have the condition, but for whatever reason, it gives you a selective advantage against getting malaria. So you're not getting malaria and you're not getting sick and dying from malaria, but because you're heterozygous, you're a carrier for sickle cell anemia. And if you marry another carrier and have children with another carrier, then there's a chance that your children will have sickle cell anemia. So natural selection doesn't make organisms better, it just makes them suited for their current environment. So a heterozygous individual isn't better, but they are suited to survive in areas where there's a lot of malaria. There are 3 types of selection we're going to explore. One is called stabilizing selection, one is called directional selection, and one is called disruptive selection. In stabilizing selection, the most common phenotype in a population is favored by the environment. So if, for instance, curly-haired was the most common, then that would be favored by the environment. You would see more curly-haired people. Individuals that show an extreme variation of the desired trait, so straight hair, would be at a disadvantage and would undergo natural selection. So stabilizing selection is the most common type of selection. This is what you would look at. So originally, this was your population where you had a variety of phenotypes, but then you were not favoring the extremes, and you were only favoring the most common. So eventually the shape of the graph would go more pointed. Some examples of stabilizing selection would be baby birth weights. In humans, baby birth weights tend to be favored around 7 pounds as a birth weight. Really, really small birth weights are not favored for because it's harder to survive when you're born really, really premature. And then really, really big birth weights are not favored because especially now we could have C-sections, but in really, like when that wasn't available, a really large baby might not be able to be birthed through the mother's birth canal. And so the mother and the baby could be at risk for not surviving the birth. Another one would be hummingbird bill length. So birds with medium bill lengths would be favored over birds with long or short bill lengths because of the food source that they're feeding on. In directional selection, the environment favors one of the extreme variations rather than the norm. So this commonly occurs during times of environmental change or when a species takes up residence in a new habitat and might need to adapt to a new food source. So the graph would look something like this. This was our original here. And then over time, everything was being favored to one of the extremes. So one example would be pesticide resistance in insects. So the insects that can survive being sprayed with a pesticide would be favored, and the ones that don't survive get wiped out. Antibiotic resistant bacteria would be another. Peppered moths, so like the white moths were favored during the times of the Industrial Revolution, where the dark moths were favored before that time. Salmon size due to gillnet fishing. So The smaller salmon that can get through the holes in the net would be favored over the larger ones that get caught. Hummingbird bill lengths, so if you had longer flowers, suddenly the birds that have the long bill lengths would be the ones that would be favored. And the ones with medium or short bill lengths can't reach the nectar. Disruptive selection is interesting because the environment favors the two extremes of the trait rather than the norm. So this can happen if a species has to adapt to a new food source again. And it could lead to the rise of two very distinct phenotypes in a population, and maybe even eliminating the intermediate phenotype. So again, this time the graph, this was the original, and now you have two peaks, and the center, the norm section, is not favored at all. Some examples of disruptive selection would be mature male coho salmon. Some of them, the larger ones, they will bully their way in to fertilize the eggs because they're bigger and they'll scare the other ones away. And then the really small male coho salmon, because they're small, they can be sneaky and they can dart in and fertilize the eggs when the bigger fish aren't looking. But the medium-sized ones aren't favored either way. Black-bellied seed cracker finches, some of them are able to eat the small seeds, and so they'll eat those ones, and then some that have the really big, thick beaks will be able to crush the seeds. Hummingbird bill length, so that would be if for some reason now you have really short flowers and really long flowers. The short-billed ones can get the food, and the long-billed ones can get the food, but the ones with medium beaks can't get the food either way.